Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Blink-182, 9. This is the band's follow-up to 2016's California, the first project released by the band to feature Matt Skiba on vocals and guitar instead of Tom DeLonge. It was kind of a new start for the band in a sense, and like I said, this is the follow-up record to that one, though kinda not, because the band dropped pretty much an album's worth of content in the deluxe edition of California that came out the year after that album's release. And when it came to both the standard and deluxe editions of that record, I thought the standard edition was just a pretty average album overall. I feel like it was way too overproduced. A lot of the song ideas on there were really basic and typical for the band, and the lyrics really weren't all too standout either. But at the same time, there still were some, decent cuts on that record that I do return to. However, on the deluxe edition of that record, or at least the new tracks that were released as a part of the deluxe edition to that album, I felt like the band was improving to some extent. While it still did have the really overproduced sound that was on the normal edition of the record, I felt like the song topics were a bit more interesting, the song structures were a bit more interesting as well, and Matt Skiba really came into his own a bit more on that record, at least when it came to, him performing in the context of Blink-182. I was hoping that on this new project here, Blink would continue to expand on some of the stronger points of the deluxe edition of California and just deliver a solid project, but given some of the singles that were released for this thing, my hopes for the project were kind of decreased because I didn't really care for a lot of the singles here. And after listening to this thing as a whole a good few times now, this isn't quite the album I was hoping from Blink after California in its deluxe edition. This project is one that I feel kind of conflicted on in a sense. I mean, I know pretty well where I stand with whether or not I like or dislike this project, but the reasons why are a bit complicated in some regards, because while I don't care for this album, it's not because this project necessarily continues to push the things I disliked in California even further. It's a completely new set of problems here on 9 for the most part that makes this a kind of unpleasant experience for me personally. When it comes to the sound of this record, this is probably the aspect of the album that my opinion is most conflicted on in some regards, because on the one hand, I really like how this record, at least when it comes to the instruments, is a lot less overproduced compared to California. It was a big complaint I had with that record, and I'm happy it's fixed here to some extent. My only complaint really is that the way that all the instruments kind of come together here on this new record sounds just absolutely awful, even though it is a lot more natural sounding. Like the guitars and bass on this thing just kind of blend together into this droning wall of noise that just isn't really all that interesting to listen to. There's not really all that many memorable riffs in there, and it just kind of becomes this droning background noise that this record is just constantly playing. That's what it sounds like, because the way everything is mixed together here just doesn't allow for any of the instruments to really stand out and be super interesting. The drums here are decent, I guess. A bit of a step down, in my opinion, compared to some of Travis's best work on previous Blink albums. I mean, I wouldn't say the drums here are awful. They're probably the strongest instrument, but still, just not his most memorable work. And the way that they're mixed in here as well just doesn't make for them to be really standout or interesting anyway. All the instrumentals here on this record, while they do have a more natural feel to them, are just so, I guess, unmemorable, and at the same time, the way that they're produced just makes it all kind of blend together into this one sounding wall of noise. There will be some exceptions to this here on the project. The track Blame It On My Youth, in the case of this song, it's not exactly for the better, as this is one of the tracks on the record I feel like where the really overproduced sound of California kind of makes a return, and the sound of this track just isn't very good at all. It kind of sounds like a lot of the other songs on this record in regards that the mixing of everything just isn't all that great, but at the same time it kind of has this poppy coat of paint over it too, and it just sounds really awkward in the context of the record as a whole, because a lot of the other songs don't sound this poppy, but at the same time, it's just not pleasant, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, the way this track sounds. And everything else about this song, too, the really annoying hook here on this track, the vocals, the lyrics here, it's all just makes for one of the worst, if not the worst song on this entire project. The closing track to this thing, Remember to Forget Me, is a song that brings in some acoustic instrumentation, which is pretty nice because I feel like it's really needed after a lot of the songs on this thing just sound really similar to one another. Even if this track just sounds like another generic pop punk acoustic, slow cuts. I mean, at least in the context of this record, I kind of appreciate what it's trying to do. And then you have the track Ransom, which is just a really odd song that once again has some more poppy elements mixed into it, particularly towards the start of this track, where you have some more electronic elements going in here. The way the vocals kind of play out here on this track is kind of like this echoey type of vocal delivery that feels like it's like at home on some sort of hip-hop or pop track. It really reminds me of some particular artist or song, but I just cannot for the life of me remember what it is, and it's been eating away at me for the past few days. But yeah, it's definitely kind of odd, and once again doesn't really fit all too nicely into the context of the sound of the rest of this record. Fortunately, the second half of this track kind of switches things up into this faster, more in-your-face pop-punk cut, which does make a bit more sense, even if it's still not super interesting. Yeah, Ransom just kind of feels like another weird detour in the album's track listing that I didn't really appreciate. So overall, I'm kind of conflicted when it comes to the instrumentals here on this project, because on the one hand, I liked that they sounded a bit more raw compared to California. It's something I really wanted coming off of that album, but at the same time, the way it all just comes together here just doesn't sound very good to me, and the way that the songs are performed here just doesn't sound super exciting either. The songwriting doesn't help it either by being just pretty typical too. Overall, the instrumentals just aren't really all that standout here. When it comes to the vocals, though, one thing that really surprised me, at least compared to the instrumentals, is that they do sound really overproduced still. There doesn't seem to be a single cut on this record where it doesn't sound like Mark and Matt's vocals aren't going through some kind of effect to make them sound super clean and squeaky. I didn't like it when they did this on previous releases, and I don't like it here either. It just doesn't fit their voices all that well. I think the two of them have, nice singing voices, and just making them sound a bit more overproduced just kind of sucks the life out of them. And especially when you compare it to the instrumentals here on this project, which sound a bit more raw, it makes for a kind of weird mashup of sounds. The fact that the instrumentals here sound a bit more aggressive and natural, but the vocals still sound as weird and overproduced as ever, just makes for a weird mix of sounds that I didn't really like. Outside of the overproduced nature of the vocals, I do feel like the two vocalists here are putting a lot of effort into making the vocals on this album sound good. Underneath all of that, post-production stuff and all of that extra stuff piled on top, I could tell that they're trying to make the vocals on this record sound genuinely good. Particularly towards the start of this record, they are able to craft some genuinely catchy tracks on songs like Happy Days, Heaven, maybe even Dark Side. But at the same time, the production and the sound of these songs is really what holds them back from being enjoyable Blink-182 cuts to me personally, because while I do want to listen to these songs because I find them catchy and kind of fun, they just are kind of grating to listen to, unfortunately. Another thing that I kind of like about this record is that Matt Skiba's presence is a lot more felt here than on California, at least the standard edition of that record. But I don't think he has too many moments on here that are, super unique in his own, and just a moment where I feel like years down the line I'm going to be saying that's an iconic Matt Skiba moment on a Blink record or anything. I think there's a lot more moments on this thing where his vocal presence is really unique and felt compared to Mark's, and I kind of like that. I just wish that the songs that he appeared on here were maybe a bit stronger, because if that was the case, it would have been exactly what I wanted out of this record, really, at least in that regard. The track Black Rain is one of the cuts on this thing that I do feel like is one of the stronger ones here. In fact, I might even go as far as to say it's my favorite song on this entire thing. I love the vibe that the band shoots for here on this track. I think the vocals here are probably the strongest on the record as well. The catchiness of this song is also pretty enjoyable too. The one thing I just really don't like about this track is that it ends way too soon. Like, just as I'm really getting into this track, it just ends. Like, there's no fade out or anything. It just kind of cuts out, ends, moves on to the next song, and just leaves me wondering to myself, why? Like, why couldn't this song continue on a bit longer? It's a pretty decent track from the band, not one of my favorites or anything. A big reason as to which that is the case is because it cuts off so soon, but yeah, I just wish this track was longer overall. I do think it's one of the stronger songs here, but even this one does still have its flaws. Lyrically, this record isn't one that I find to be super interesting either. Not that Blink have ever had like the best lyrics on the planet or anything like that. However, I felt like on California, the band had kind of stooped to writing a lot of really generic and cliche lyrics that I just really couldn't find myself getting invested in. And here on this project, I will say that the lyrics are slightly better. The song topics that they decided to cover are slightly more interesting. However, I do feel like a lot of the times on this thing they end up once again kind of falling into a lot of, typical song ideas or cliches to the point where I once again just kind of feel like I can't really get into these songs too much because lyrically I just feel like I've heard them many times before at this point. Some of the more interesting cuts on this record lyrically include Heaven, which was inspired by one of the many mass shootings that have happened recently. And while I do think the lyrics on this track in that regard are a bit more interesting, the band still kind of has to go and mess it up to some extent because there is a verse on this thing that Matt Skiba delivers that just kind of seems to be about a breakup instead, which, I mean, isn't terrible in its own right, but it just kind of feels weird being placed on this track alongside lyrics about a much more serious, piece of subject matter, and it just kind of once again feels like a missed opportunity because the subject matter here is, interesting, something where the band could have said something really impactful, but I don't really feel like they hit the mark as much as they should have here on this track. This song should have been a bit more impactful than what we actually get. And then on the closing track to this record, Remember to Forget Me, the lyrics are essentially kind of talking about moving on from like your mother to just kind of go out in life on your own, which I guess as far as like song topics go isn't a bad one or anything. It just feels kind of weird coming from Blink-182 given that, the band is rather old at this point. All the members have been pretty successful in music for over like 2 decades at this point. Writing a song about kind of moving on from your mom at this point just feels really weird. Like, it's a bit late, guys. Like, several decades late. Overall, 9 is a pretty frustrating album for me. On the one hand, I like the fact that the band fixed some of the problems I had with their last record. I like the fact that it has a more natural sound to it. I like the fact that the lyrics and song topics are a bit more interesting. I like the fact that Matt Skiba has a bigger presence here on this thing. I just really don't like a lot of the aspects of this thing as well. I don't like the fact that the mixing and production here sounds pretty awful throughout. I don't like the fact that a lot of the songs on here sound really samey to one another with how they're written, and a lot of the songs that break away from this mold don't necessarily do so for the better, and oftentimes end up being some of the worst cuts on this thing. I don't like the fact that the vocals on this thing are still really overproduced, and that a lot of the lyrics here are still pretty generic and uninteresting. Overall, I'd say this record is better than what you might expect given, Blame It On My Youth being the first single to this thing, but still, I feel like the band took some steps forward here on this thing, but took more steps back than what was, allowed for them to do in order to consider this album a, improvement over their last one pretty much, and an improvement over even just the deluxe edition tracks from that last album too. So overall, I didn't really care for this thing, but that is just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.